The neighbor in the window. When my family and I moved into our new home, it seemed quiet, cozy, and above all, safe. A spacious backyard for our 6-year-old twins, Sam and Robbie, a charming white gate, and a carefully manicured lawn. It was a dream come true. The only thing that gave me a slight sense of discomfort was the neighbor's windows overlooking our backyard. Those windows belonged to Steve, a man in his 40s who had recently moved in. We tried to introduce ourselves, but he was withdrawn, spoke with a heavy accent, and seemed to avoid social interactions. At first, I thought he was just shy, but soon I realized there was something deeply unsettling about him. The first omen. It all started on a scorching July afternoon. Sam and Robbie were playing in the backyard, splashing in their inflatable pool, laughing and screaming with joy. I was mowing the lawn near the garage when I felt someone's eyes on me. Looking up, I noticed the curtains in one of Steve's second-floor windows shift slightly. There he was. Steve stood still, staring at the kids. His face was expressionless, his eyes cold and dead. As soon as he noticed me looking back, he stepped away from the window and the curtain fell back into place. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just passing by the window. But deep down, a small chill had begun to take root. The flash in the window. A week passed, and I had almost forgotten about the incident. But one evening, while the kids were once again playing in the backyard, something happened that brought the fear rushing back. Robbie burst into the house, his face pale, his eyes wide. "There was a light!" he yelled. "In the neighbor's window!" I stepped outside and froze. In one of Steve's second-floor windows, a bright flash of light went off, like a camera flash. It was so sudden and out of place that I doubted I'd even seen it. "What exactly did you see?" I asked the kids. "It was a flash," Robbie insisted. Carol, my wife, urged me to go talk to Steve. I knocked on his door several times, but he didn't answer. My anger and unease grew, but I had no choice but to let it go. For now. The night visitor. Later that night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint but distinct, like the creaking of a gate or the rustle of leaves. The clock on the nightstand read 3:12 a.m. I went downstairs and carefully approached the living room window. Through a gap in the curtain, I saw a figure. Someone was standing just outside our fence, motionless. The faint glow of the streetlight barely illuminated the silhouette, but I knew it was Steve. He stood completely still, like a statue. As I watched, he slowly turned his head toward our house, and a wave of dread washed over me. Without turning on the light, I went upstairs to look out at his house. The window where I'd seen the flash earlier was now brightly lit. Behind the curtain, a figure moved. An intruder. The next day, I decided to install security cameras. I didn't have enough evidence to go to the police, but I felt certain that something was wrong. A week later, I was woken in the middle of the night by a muffled tapping sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent enough to jolt me awake. I opened the camera feed on my phone but saw nothing, just the empty backyard. When I went downstairs to investigate, my heart sank. One of the kitchen windows was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it before bed. On the windowsill and floor beneath it, there was a smudge of wet dirt, as if someone had stepped in mud and then climbed inside. Carol and the kids were still asleep, but I stayed awake until dawn, unable to shake the feeling that someone had been in our home. The climax. Finally, I called the police to file a report. They said they would check on Steve, but they couldn't guarantee much without concrete evidence. That evening, I noticed Steve's house was dark, his windows shut. For the first time in weeks, it seemed like he wasn't home. But that night, something terrifying happened. At 2:45 a.m., the motion detector on the backyard camera went off. My phone buzzed and I immediately checked the feed. A blurred figure stood near the back door. I couldn't make out any details, but it wasn't my imagination. Grabbing a knife, I ran outside, my heart pounding. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The next morning, I told Carol we needed to leave. By the end of the week, we packed up and moved out. The aftermath, months later, I visited the neighborhood to pick up some mail that had been mistakenly delivered to our old address. Steve's house stood empty. The neighbors said he'd moved out shortly after we did, but no one had seen him leave. As I turned to go, I couldn't resist glancing back at his house one last time. And in one of the second-floor windows, I saw a familiar shadow. It stood still, watching me. The neighbors, across the street. When I first saw the house, it looked completely ordinary. A quiet street, a small flower bed in front, and a clean asphalt driveway. I rented it without hesitation. It was the perfect place for me, a college student who had just moved to town for school. The only thing that seemed a little odd was the house across the street. The windows on the second floor were always covered with heavy curtains, and the lower floor looked abandoned. Still, I assumed the house was simply vacant. I shared my new home with another student named Chloe. For the first few weeks, we lived peacefully. School, movie nights, and occasional walks around the neighborhood. But everything changed after one particular evening. Light in the empty house. I was sitting in the kitchen, studying, when I noticed the curtains in the second-floor window of the house across the street shift slightly. For a moment, I saw a face behind the glass. It was strange. I had been sure that the house was unoccupied. I told Chloe about it, but she just brushed it off. "Maybe someone moved in," she said, "or you're just tired and imagining things." I didn't argue, but a sense of unease began to settle inside me. The next evening, I saw movement in the same window again. The curtains parted slightly, and I felt someone staring straight at me. The knock at the window. A few days passed, and nothing strange happened. I had almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But one night, around 3 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It was a faint knock, as if someone was tapping gently on glass. My heart froze when I realized the sound was coming from my bedroom window. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were closed, but the moonlight made them slightly translucent. Behind the fabric, I could make out the outline of a person. Trying not to make a sound, I slipped out of bed and crept to the door of my bedroom. My fingers trembled as I locked it. I didn't know what to do, so I sat in the corner of my room until dawn. The mysterious neighbors. The next morning, I told Chloe what had happened. She tried to reassure me, saying it might have been a trick of the light or a half-awake hallucination. I didn't believe her. That evening, I decided to investigate the house across the street myself. Around midnight, I turned off the lights in my room and stood by the window with a pair of binoculars. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I focused on the second floor of the house. At first, nothing. But after about 10 minutes, I noticed the curtains shift slightly. Behind them, something moved. It wasn't a face. It was distorted, as if it was looking at me from another world. Then the curtains fell back into place. The neighbors at my door. A few nights later, Chloe left to visit her parents, and I was home alone. I was lying on the couch in the living room when I heard slow footsteps ascending the steps of the porch. I tensed, waiting for the doorbell to ring, but instead, I heard a faint scraping sound, like someone fiddling with the lock. I grabbed the closest object I could find, a kitchen knife, and froze behind the corner wall. The noises stopped, but summoning my courage, I peeked through the peephole. 2 figures stood on the porch. They stood side by side, their faces hidden in shadows. One of them leaned forward as if trying to peer directly into the peephole. I couldn't move. Then they turned and walked back toward the house across the street. The empty house. The next morning, I called the police to report the strange figures. 2 officers searched the house across the street, but said it was empty. "Are you sure no one was there?" I asked, practically pleading for them to reconsider. "There's no one, miss. The house has been vacant for a long time," one of them replied. As they drove away, I noticed that one of the second-floor curtains in the house shifted slightly again. The ending. A few days later, I moved out. Chloe and I never talked about what had happened again, but sometimes when I pass by certain windows, I feel like someone is watching me. And I remember the house across the street, its windows still covered with those heavy curtains. The strange house next door. When Sarah and I moved into our new house, it felt like a fresh start. It was a small suburban home on a quiet street with enough space to grow a garden and host barbecues. We were excited to build a life here, but from the moment we moved in, the house next door felt off. It wasn't the house itself. It was perfectly ordinary, with peeling white paint and a small, unkempt lawn. It was the people who lived there that unsettled us. At first, we thought the house was abandoned, but on our first evening, we saw a light flicker on in an upstairs window. A shadow moved past, and then another. We tried to introduce ourselves, but no one ever came to the door. Instead, we only caught glimpses of them. A man and a woman, middle-aged, always standing at the second-floor window, staring at our house. The watching neighbors. It started as a strange annoyance. Whenever Sarah or I stepped into the backyard, we felt their eyes on us. I'd glance up, and there they were, standing at their window, motionless. They didn't wave, didn't smile, just stared. One foggy morning, while I was raking leaves, I decided to wave at them. I smiled and raised my hand, hoping to break the tension. They didn't move. Their faces didn't even register that I was there, yet I could feel their unblinking eyes fixed on me. When I told Sarah about it, she laughed nervously. "Maybe they're just lonely," she said, "or socially awkward." But over the next few days, their constant staring began to bother her too. The late-night visitor. One night, as we lay in bed, a faint knocking sound woke us up. I glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from one of the windows downstairs. "Stay here," I whispered to Sarah as I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap on the glass. When I reached the living room, I froze. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the shadow of a figure just outside the window. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped. Silence. Summoning my courage, I flicked on the porch light and peeked through the blinds. There was no one there. I turned back to the stairs. And that's when I heard it again. 3 sharp knocks, this time on the sliding glass door leading to the backyard. The backyard. I rushed to the kitchen and turned on the backyard floodlight. The yard was empty. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. But as I stood there staring into the shadows, I noticed something chilling. The upstairs window of the house next door. The man and woman were standing there, as always. But something was different this time. Their faces were closer to the glass than usual, pressed against it. Their features were pale and distorted, as if the glass warped them. I turned off the light and backed away, too frightened to do anything else. Uninvited guests. The next day, Sarah and I decided we'd had enough. We walked around the block to the neighbor's house and knocked on their door. After a long pause, the door creaked open slightly. A man in his 20s stood there, his face half hidden in shadow. He wasn't one of the people we'd seen in the upstairs window. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone flat. I introduced myself and asked if he lived alone. He nodded. "Do you ever see anyone else here?" I asked hesitantly. "Like a man and a woman upstairs?" His expression didn't change. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. As Sarah and I walked back to our house, I glanced over my shoulder. The man was still standing in the doorway, watching us. The scream. A week passed without incident. We tried to ignore the house next door, keeping the blinds closed and avoiding the backyard. Then, one night, we heard the scream. It was a high-pitched, blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the stillness of the night. It came from the house next door. Sarah grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Call the police," she whispered. I hesitated. Something about the scream. It didn't sound entirely human. When the police arrived, they searched the house. An officer came to our door afterward and assured us it was empty. "No signs of anyone living there," he said. "But we've seen them," I insisted. "The people in the upstairs window—" The officer cut me off. "That house has been abandoned for years." The final glimpse. The next morning, we decided to leave. I couldn't take it anymore. As we packed the car, I glanced up at the house one last time. The curtains on the second floor were open. The man and woman were standing there, staring at me. But this time, their mouths were wide open in silent screams. We never came back.